I would also like to take this opportunity to introduce our webinar. This is part of the series of the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Center webinars, which was a research that investigated the kinds of politics that promote development and was funded by the now Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. I'm assuming that's what DFID is now called, or that's part of DFID now. We have three presenters, and I will introduce each of them by in terms of how they will do their presentations. So we will start with Tom Goodfellow, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. Tom, you want to raise your hand so people can see who you are?
Hi.
And so Tom was part of the research, the ESID research, and his focus was looking at the political economic determinants of growth and urban programs. And he will have 5 minutes first to introduce the framework for political settlements and urban governance, and then he will come back again to, after Eob's presentation, to look at the comparative findings of the ESID project. And then we have Eob, Gabri Mariam. Eob, if you would like to raise your hand so people can see who you are. And Eob is a fellow in the Department of International Development at LSE, and he convenes courses on Africa political economy and Africa development. He's an alumni of the University of Manchester's Development Policy and Management. And then we have Diana Mitlin, who is a professor of global urbanism in the Global Institute of the Global Development Institute of the University of Manchester. She's also a principal researcher with the International Institute of Environment and Development. And then more recently, and starting this year, she will be the lead manager of the Africa Cities Research Consortium, and she will speak about that and link it to the work that ESID has done. Thank you everyone for coming. Just a few sort of like house rules. If you can all mute, I'm sure you are all so used to all of this now. If you can mute yourselves when you are not speaking. And then because we have a very limited time, I would suggest that if people have comments, could they put them in the chat? And then we'll try and have the presentations done by within 20-25 minutes, so that we can have at least a minimum of 30 minutes for discussion. So if you, while the presentations are ongoing, if you can put any comments or questions in the chat, then we can get back to them later. Thank you very much. So I would like to ask Tom to take the podium, as it were, metaphorical podium, and introduce us to the, yeah.
Thank you very much, Beth. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Despite, of course, this world we're now in, I don't have that much experience of presenting on Zoom, so let's hope this works okay. And I've just had to splice together my presentation with Eob's, which caused a few problems. So can you all see my first slide at this point? Okay, just a moment. Hang on a second. something that's strange has happened to my, I think, just a moment. Sorry, I'm just going to start that again.
Tom, it works better if you've loaded up the slide presentation to go. Don't ask me why.
I'm not sure what you mean. I've said that.
Already pressed slideshow begin before you share screen share.
Oh, I see what you mean. Thank you. Yeah, so now I'm showing my lack of experience with Zoom.
Tom, can I also quickly come in? I forgot to mention that we would like to record this session. Is there anyone who has an objection to that? Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, perfect.
In full screen mode?
Yeah.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, Beth, please be strict with me. And you might have to be vocally strict with me because I can't see you currently as I'm presenting.
My face is very expressive. You'll see when you have it.
Okay, yes, I've got you on my screen now. Okay, so I'm just going to very briefly introduce this project. As you can see, there's a large number of names here on this first slide. And that's because this project involved a large number of people, some of whom are here today, but many of whom couldn't be. But it's really great to be here sharing this with you and to have so many people here. So obviously myself and Eyab are here and we're going to be talking about it. But the project did involve all of these people in a number of case studies, which I'll mention. All of these people down on the left were involved in case study-based research in Ethiopia, Uganda, Dhaka, Bangladesh, and Zambia. And then we also had some other case studies that later we added to the project, which is the people there on the right. So we have a really fantastic range of contributors who all contributed to the things that we're going to be saying. I just wanted, by way of background, say how this project came about. And it was partly because, as many of you will know, ESID had done a lot of work on many different aspects of development and service delivery. And a number of the countries that research had been happening in were of the dominant party variety in relation to a kind of political settlement approach. So countries where one political party, one ruling elite dominated the political landscape with little space for opposition. And many of those countries were also, or some of them were ones with significant developmental achievements. So I think ESID was interested in doing some more work on how dominant political settlements are maintained over time. But at the same time, they were also interested in doing more on urban development, on urban issues. Because there had been relatively little in the earlier part of ESID on urban issues, despite the fact that these are really significant politically and increasingly in terms of development. So capital cities, which is what we focus on in this project, are particularly important because in most cases, not all, they house political sovereignty. They're home to large numbers of politicians and political elites, and consequently where a lot of resistance manifests. They're also major drivers of economic growth. And certainly in Africa and many parts of Asia, they tend to be highly primate. So one city, usually the capital, is far, far larger than all the others. So that's why they're very significant spaces to look at when trying to understand political relations. So what we set out to do was to bring these things together in a new project that would look at how attempts to build and maintain dominance by ruling parties, ruling coalitions, how those played out in capital cities, and how we could therefore use that as a way to understand how dominant regimes survive in power, but also what it tells us about the kind of urban projects that get prioritized, the kinds of urban governance strategies that elites develop in relation to their political goals of maintaining a dominant position. So we deliberately set out to choose countries that all had some kind of dominant type political settlement. On the one hand, we wanted countries that had been in a position where there was one dominant elite for a long time. So two of our case studies, one of which, of course, Eyab will be talking about, were situations where you had dominant party regimes, but those are also coming under threat in a number of ways over time. Then we also wanted to look at some countries where you'd had quite a competitive political space, but that had very recently, or quite recently, in recent years, become much more of a dominant settlement. And for that, we chose to look at Bangladesh and Zambia. Thanks, Beth. And then later on, particularly as we look towards developing this into a book project, we chose 2 other cases. One was Zimbabwe, specifically Harare, where of course you have very, very interesting dynamics in an opposition supporting city and efforts to try and dominate it by the ruling national regime. And then Colombo in Sri Lanka, partly because we did want a balance of Asian and African cities. And there was a very interesting story there about the transformation and political intervention in the capital, even though it wasn't so significant to the national political settlement. So we set out to ask how parties seek to build, consolidate and maintain dominance in capital cities through particular kinds of urban programs, and what accounts for the variation in the kinds of strategies you see as people try and maintain dominance in cities. We also set out to ask how these were contested. These strategies for dominance were contested by different groups, but I'm not going to speak so much about that. And in the end, it wasn't such a central part of a lot of the empirical research. So just before I go, this is a kind of visual representation of a conceptual framework that we started with. Importantly, we make a distinction between generative interventions, which are interventions by ruling elites that attempt to build some new pole of support. Their intention is to create new forms of support within the city. And we can contrast those with repressive forms of intervention, where the primary goal of that intervention is to constrain or crush opposition in some way. Now, obviously these overlap, and things that might be intended as generative could also have repressive side effects deliberately or otherwise. And then within this kind of 2 overlapping general modalities, we identified 5 types of strategies, which I'll unpack a bit later on. Some of which are straightforward kind of repression and coercion, or on the other end, co-optation, trying to generate new sites of support. But there were others that perhaps fell in between or weren't straightforwardly either generative or repressive. We've included within that a focus on the discourses that elites mobilize to try and maintain control, whether those are developmentalist ones or populist ones about directly connecting with the urban poor, or perhaps discourses around securitizing the city that often support coercive measures. But we also distinguish between, for example, coercive distribution, which is where people are allowed access to public goods, but only if they do certain things like join a party. And we looked at other things around legal restructuring, legal maneuvers in terms of ways of trying to constrain the opposition's room for maneuver through fiddling around with your urban governance structures and things like that, which were not straightforwardly either repressive or generative. So I'll hand over. I think I'm out of time, and now Eob's going to talk about Addis.
Thank you so much, Tom, and you are just slightly over time. So we will move to Eob, who is going to present the Addis Ababa case study, which was part of this project. Over to you, Eob.
Okay, thank you, Beth. So Tom will be helping me in clicking from slide to slide. So my presentation is based on the paper that I published in this project on the topic of the politics of dominating Addis Ababa, with a specific focus on the timeline between 2005 and 2018. And the key question that I aim to answer was, after surviving the most competitive election in 2005, how did EPRDF dominated the socio-economic and political sphere of the capital city Addis Ababa? And most importantly, a lot has been said and written about the authoritarian nature of EPRDF's regime. My specific contribution to this particularly in this paper was not on the repressive, but rather on the generative intervention that Tom was highlighting earlier. So more of focusing on the soft power, how EPRDF managed to create new forms of coalition, a new base and support, base of support after 2005. And as you can see, Ethiopia's GDP has expanded within this specific period of time, almost 7-fold. And Addis Ababa, the capital city, is also a prime city, which has almost 10 times bigger population size. And EPRDF's hyper-modernist intervention, developmental aspiration is very much manifested within the city, where you have almost like the 60% of the service sector located there, and also all that has been talking about the manufacturing aspect is also, most of the factories are also located around Addis Ababa. And Addis Ababa is, of course, the prime center of opposition political party mobilization. And a good example with that regard is the 2005 election, where the ruling party lost almost every single seat in the capital, in the council of the city. Next slide, Tom. So I focused on 3 specific strategies of dominance. One is using developmentalism as a legitimizing discourse. And the second one is about how the PRDF managed to use legal maneuvering to boost its dominance. And the third one is a specific context-dependent relation with different social groups. In terms of developmentalism, I think probably the Ethiopian case is the one where we had a specific regime that has a clearly stated objective of building a developmental state. So developmentalism was very much at the center of the regime's orientation. So socioeconomic policies that focus on improving people's lives in terms of housing, education, health, and access to facilities such as roads and institutions of learning and health facilities was also a major aspect of PRDF's expenditure. And a number of studies have shown that there was a so-called proper expenditure, where the regime was using almost 70% of the national budget to cover specific areas of education, health, agriculture, and food security. And these are some of the numbers that would definitely indicate the developmentalist aspiration of the PRDF regime, where you have 50,000 agriculture extension workers, 9,000 farmer training centers, which means like 1 in every local administration, and 50,000 health extension workers and health posters, around 15,000. This shows the extent to which that PRDF has been using developmentalism as one way of maintaining its dominance, not only at the capital city, but also across the country. Next slide. A major aspect of our research was about political settlement, the role of political settlement. And I can say that like developmentalism, this developmentalist orientation of the regime has helped the regime to use these generative interventions to distribute benefits and rents to the non-elites, while at the same time using the repressive interventions, politically spelled legal instruments to keep rival political forces at the base. So the horizontal relationship with competing political actors was controlled through legal frameworks, but the vertical relation with the non-elites was maintained through these developmentalist interventions. Next slide. The second one is legal maneuvering. A number of legal frameworks were established to control, as I said, competing legal political forces. And particularly in Addis Ababa, there was an expansion of local government structures, which also come along with having multiple layers of control and administration. Next slide. This slide shows the extent to which that formal structures of the city administration were somehow very much relying on the non-formal channels of communication, channels of control and distribution of economic and political resources, and also as use of political control. You have the city administration, the sub-city, and the district, which are the formal channels of governance, but you have also the zonal council, and you have women's development team, young people's development team, and inhabitants development team, which are also somehow further go down to the doorsteps of the inhabitants with 1 to 5 structures. So such kind of pervasiveness of the state, of the government in each and every life of the people has contributed both as a channel of control, as I said, but also as part of mobilizing people into the local government structure processes. Next slide. My case study specifically focused on 2 cases of the urban consumers cooperatives in Addis Ababa and the youth employment programs. And within these programs, I tried to show the extent to which how contextualized use of cooperation and cooptation strategies served the interests of the ruling elite, particularly PRDF when it was in power, both to distribute rents, to distribute benefits and opportunities, and also at the same time to control the mobilization of opposition groups, their capacity to mobilize the majority of the city dwellers, primarily young people and women. Next slide. In my case study, the urban consumers cooperatives, it's in many countries, both in mainly Middle Eastern and African countries, price hikes in essential food items cause food riots, political chaos, and sometimes violent conflict. And capital cities are the primary center of such kind of situations. And in Ethiopia, primarily in 2008, there was like a record of 61.8% food price inflation. But it's never caused any kind of riot or any kind of political problem. What the PRDF managed to do is to mobilize the urban poor who were very much at the receiving end of this food price inflation, and to mobilize them and to bring them in, to have them organized and be one of the key actors of the distribution of essential food items. And these urban consumers cooperatives managed to mobilize a huge number of people within their structure. And both the ruling party benefited from that in terms of not having the urban poor getting against its political programs, but at the same time for the urban poor who were very much at the mercy of the market, which was not in favor of them in terms of both artificially created price hikes and like hoarding of items. So they took it, they both collaborated each other and somehow benefited out of that. But PRDF also managed to infiltrate these urban consumers cooperatives and use them as one aspect of political mobilization. Whenever there was election, whenever there was some kind of politically sensitive situations are happening, the urban consumers and cooperatives become like additional channels of the political mobilization, along with the youth groups, the youth leagues, and the women's leagues. Next slide. So in terms of the youth employment program, until 2005, PRDF never had a specific political strategy towards young people. It's only after 2005, when the opposition particularly managed to mobilize the urban youth against PRDF, that PRDF became a proactive actor in terms of mobilizing young people in the political process. And economically, it brought them on board through micro and small scale enterprises by providing economic opportunities of job opportunities and bring them into action along with its massive condominium house building projects or road maintenance activities. And politically, of course, there was also an establishment of youth platforms such as the Youth League and the Youth Forum. What happened was also, the process was also beneficial at some point for both actors. There were overlapping interests both between the young people and the PRDF, especially in the aftermath of the 2005 election, because PRDF has already lost its legitimacy and acceptance because of losing the election and the consequence of the violence. But young people also felt a little bit disfranchised and not part of the process. Can I have 1 minute? Okay, so that brings them on board to collaborate. But it was also a process of co-optation, because especially after 2010, once the PRDF controlled almost each and every structure of state apparatus, the PRDF started to demand serious membership of the Youth League so that young people can have access to economic opportunities, even though they are already operating these micro, small scale enterprises. So the cooperation and cooptation processes happen contextually depending on the time. Thank you. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Iyo. Tom, could you just focus on the sort of like our comparative findings from the project?
Yes, thank you. What I'm going to do now is just rapidly try and speak through some of the emerging comparative findings. Should just say Eob's paper is online. It's a fantastic, rich case study, and we now have 5 and nearly 6 of them up online on the UCID site of the case studies, as well as the conceptual paper by David Jackman and myself. And what I'm going to say now also has been developed collaboratively with David, this comparative analysis. I'm just going to go until I run out of time, because I'm not quite sure whether I'll get everything in, Beth, but I'll stop when I need to stop, because I've just got a few comparative findings that have been coming through. And it has been, quite recently we've done this because we've been trying to incorporate the findings from Harare and Colombo, Sri Lanka, which has added some really interesting dimensions to the comparative study that we've been doing. So first of all, I mean, this is an obvious point, but what's been very clear is that both repressive and generative interventions are central to strategies for dominance in all cases. And it's not necessarily, there's not necessarily a significant difference in terms of country regimes, dominant coalitions that have come to power militarily in places like Uganda or Ethiopia, and those that have come to power through democracy. In both cases, we see heavy repression and coercion, as well as a number of generative measures. And in fact, if we want to understand why some dominant coalitions tend to use certain kinds of strategies more than others, this is often more about the history of the institutionalization of political parties and also the opposition movements and what they've been doing. So, it's been very challenging to look across 6 complex cases and say, this determines that and this determines this. But we have seen some patterns emerge that have been quite interesting. It's pretty clear that trying to build dominance in the first place, regardless of how you come to power, is quite a different process from trying to maintain it. But again, that plays out differently in different ways. So in cases like the Addis case and in Bangladesh, to some extent, it seems that violent repression is more central to achieving dominance in the first place. But to sustain it over time, we've seen a need for these more generative and sometimes quite developmental interventions to sustain that dominance. Whereas what's been happening in Zambia has been a little more the other way around, where a party that had built its power and its dominance within the city through building support in populist ways among the poor and then also among the middle classes, has only managed to sustain that dominance by becoming more violent and coercive over time. When you have countries, cases like Kampala and Harare, where you've had a dominant party in power for a very long time, which has never really succeeded in dominating the city. So the opposition in the city keeps resurfacing and the ruling coalition has struggled to dominate the city. You tend to see lots of different strategies deployed over time, often experimenting with one thing, going to another, in a sort of cocktail of repression and co-optation, sometimes targeted at the poor, sometimes targeted at the middle class, with less of a clear trajectory. Now, of course, one of the things that affects the nature of these different strategies over time is the electoral cycle. So just to go back to this diagram, which was really something to think with, of course, we've problematized it in many ways and things don't easily sit within these categories or even necessarily a continuum. But to some extent, it's quite clear that around election time, particularly, let's say, in the year before elections, you see more things at either end, either extreme here. So the repressive measures are more likely to be violent and coercive. There's more likely to be arbitrary measures. And the co-optation is more likely to be of the kind sometimes called forbearance in places like Kampala, where, for example, just allowing people to contravene regulations, letting people do what they want, rather than implementing the law. These kinds of things are ramped up around election times. Whereas in the periods in between, where you're a few years away for election, is when we start to see more things like reshuffling of administrative structures, changing your district boundaries, bringing in legislation like surveillance legislation, lots of kind of interesting pieces of legislation passed targeted at urban opposition around IT and controlling cyberspace. So those kinds of things tend to happen in line with the electoral cycle to some extent. Don't know why that's come out that way. The other thing, of course, that's very important is the legacies of political dissent, and specifically urban dissent involving groups like students and unions. Because where you have countries where there has been organized and institutionalized urban opposition over a long period of time, you are more likely to see the state have to offer more developmental kinds of generative intervention in response, by which I mean sustained programs of public goods provision or infrastructure, some of the kinds of things that Eob has talked about, rather than more sporadic favors here and there. So in the places where we've seen that longer history of urban dissent, like, for example, Addis, Dhaka, and Lusaka, you either tend to get a developmental response, or if the state can't provide that, or is panicking, then there's a ramping up of violence and repression. But whereas in contexts where there's never been such organized and institutionalized urban opposition, like in Kampala, it's easier to buy off the urban population with more sporadic and piecemeal forms of generative intervention. So you see less of those more developmental long-term interventions, although you do also get violence and repression, but often coming in waves at different times. The other thing, of course, and this goes to the heart of thinking about political settlements, is that the ruling coalitions matter. The role of the military within them matters in different ways. But also when you get a crisis at a certain point in time within the ruling coalition, you can see some abrupt shifts. So even though the same party has been in power in Zambia for a while now, the PF, when the President Sata died and there was a kind of bodged handling of the transition to Lungu, we saw a real change and an increased reliance on repression because of the way that the crisis within the coalition managed that change. And obviously that's been very evident in places like Ethiopia very recently as well. Another thing that was interesting in the Harare case is when the threat of the MDC, opposition party, became very significant, there were all kinds of new measures to kind of buy support, particularly in the peripheries of Harare. So new kind of generative strategies in certain areas of the city, which I'll say more about in a moment. You can see Beth smiling, so it'll be interesting to know what she has to say about the Harare case. So another interesting point is around gender. So very obviously a lot of these strategies, whether generative or repressive, are very gendered, many targeted at men. It doesn't mean they're all targeted at men. So a lot of the youth programs are to do with the threat of urban male mobilization in the form of violence. And we see that in places like Dhaka and Addis and Kampala in the kinds of ways in which the government has tried to buy support and the people who are repressed. But then there's also normally women's initiative and women's organizations which parties work through with different strategies for women. So things about youth, that's often almost a code for men, whereas then there's separate strategies for women. And we've also seen, for example, in Kampala, efforts to co-opt a number of very high-profile women into significant urban governance roles, often sometimes who were opposition figures before. But in another example of how these things are gendered. You have
to wrap up now. Sorry to interrupt you.
Have I got to stop? Oh, sorry. I thought you were giving me 5 more minutes. I was like, brilliant. Okay. Can I have 1 more minute just to give the headlines?
Okay.
The headlines, which is, one is around the effect on city governments of strategies for dominance and how often they're undermined by central authorities and other agencies. And another point I just wanted to make was around looking spatially. So what we've really learned from Colombo and Harare is that there's some really interesting different strategies that can play out in the suburbs and peripheries relative to the city center, although we don't see that in all cities. And then finally, epidemics and pandemics, even before COVID, particularly in the case of Zambia when there was a cholera outbreak, obviously provide easy cover for more repressive strategies. And then, yes, finally, I've presented this and we thought about this as an interplay between control of the city and protest in our broader framing. But actually, at a more local level, you often see dominance co-constructed by communities, and Eob's spoken about that for particular reasons. And then final point here is that even though in the context of urbanization, capital cities really matter to ruling elites, they're not necessarily decisive. And it's been very interesting that in Uganda, the regime has never managed to really dominate the capital city, but that hasn't stopped it from dominating nationally. And in Ethiopia, even though there was a fairly successful attempt to dominate the capital city, that didn't stop the national regime from unraveling. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Tom. Let's move directly to Diana, who will look at how the African Cities Research Consortium will use ESID's political settlements approach. Diana, you have 5 minutes, so you, when I say this, I'm not meaning 5 more minutes, I'm saying stop. Okay, go ahead.
You are mute, Diana.
Start again, screen sharing. So, I don't want to interrupt your questions on Eop and Tom's fascinating presentations, but just to give you a little bit of a flavour, that the engagement of urban with political settlements doesn't stop here. So as some of you will have seen, we're going to pick up this work and blend it with other work to try and understand how some of the core challenges that exist in African cities can be addressed. So this is further work supported by FCDO. The objective that we're going to address says DFID because this predates the merger, but the objective is to produce new knowledge and evidence on African cities as systems, which leads to the development of and investment in more effective economic development and poverty reduction policies and programs in African cities by DFID and partners. So the core framework, which was established by FCDO, the core framework is to bring together an understanding of urban development and urban outcomes as a process of integration, that you cannot address these challenges through one sector alone, but at the same time, you cannot address them unless your analysis is political. And FCDO have identified the work done on political settlements as a particular way of understanding the political that has some resonance at African cities. Go on to say a little bit more about that in a minute. So the idea is that we bring together the work on political settlements, combine it with an understanding that development interventions in an urban context have got to think across sectors with some level of integration in the way they move forward. Bring those things through together and address identified priority complex problems. Now we have 4 themes through which we have to do that. We've just started. The inception phase brings together these 2 bodies of work. So how to develop a new conceptual framework that will give insight. We then apply that conceptual framework at the city scale in 13 cities, and we use that framework in cities which it appears to have a particularly conducive context. We use it to address some of these emerging problems. And throughout, we have a close engagement with stakeholders, as very much has been the plan of ECID. These are the cities. I'm not going to dwell on them. If you want to look at the website, you can see them. I'm not going to dwell because I anticipate Beth is going to be waving at me very soon. We drew together a partnership to address that. The partnership, we feel, has particularly disciplinary skills that add insight, but is also a partnership that enables to engage with multiple stakeholders, grassroots organizations, local government, professional bodies, and of course, academics in those countries. I wanted to say a little bit about political settlements and urban politics. I'm very conscious that we have ECID's, some key ECID expertise in the webinar, who may indeed get involved in answering some of the trickier questions that the audience raised. So we're going to engage with political settlements. And obviously political settlements is a theory that rests at the national level. Eop and Tom's elaboration has talked particularly about the way in which national governments achieve dominance. That has ramifications at the urban scale, I think has already been clear. But there's lots of other ways in which the engagement of national elites with cities have ramifications. Cities draw rents. We know that. National elites draw rents from cities. Very strong opportunities, particularly in capital cities. We've heard a little bit about the significance of electoral loyalties, the way in which they try and control urban space to secure electoral advantage. We've heard about the way in which they build a clientelist set of relations to enable them to have the loyalties they need to rule. And what is also evident is that the way in which they demonstrate both programs, but also a visual form of urban development has important implications for how they gain legitimacy. But urban politics is a lot more than that. Beth, I have 2 minutes to go. Urban politics is a lot more. I mean, you see some of a flavor of that with these pictures, no? Urban politics is about the way that mayors and town clerks and city leaders engage with national elites going up, but also engage downward with their own constituencies. Those local authorities have a kind of on-the-ground bureaucrats, which I think for me is summed up in this photo from Zimbabwe. But actually, this guy looks very superior to these community leaders, but he was trying to engage them. Urban spaces, as we see from the evictions in Dar es Salaam, the picture of devastation, urban spaces are all around transformation, the realization of national and city-based projects. And that has high costs for some. What are the ways in which groups push back against that, and who is advantaged from that process? Urban spaces are not just about the way in which a political opposition forms, although, as we've heard, that can be very significant. They're also spaces in which people come together to realize their needs, to, in this case from Nairobi, to challenge the way in which slums are being created and maintained and the consequences of that for populations. So in addition to political opposition, there's a level of citizen engagement with urban space and urban governance and urban politics. There are opportunities not just for confrontation, but for collaboration. Citizens and local governments come together to find new and better ways of doing things, having to have strategies that deal with rent seeking, but also deal with images about how urban development can take place. And of course, a lot of that is micro, again, go back to micro level politics, but at the councillor level this time. We have this very wonderful lady from Malawi who was engaging with her local community and learning to understand them in a different way because of how they organize. So African Cities is going to deal with the complexity of urban politics. It's going to understand and try and grasp what that means, looking at it through the lens of political settlements and going beyond that, where there appear to be constraints about those conceptual frameworks and the relationship at the national scale with urban realities.